All right, quite simply, David, what is permaculture?
Permaculture is a design system for both sustainable land use, everything from gardening to broad-scale farming and forestry, but also sustainable living. So it's concerned with both the production side of the equation and the consumption side. I suppose it's a design concept, but it's also become a movement that's spread around the world about positive environmentalism, essentially. How we can create the world we do want rather than so much focused on stopping the world we don't want.
Sure. And I think one thing people don't realise is that permaculture is more than just about growing, fruit and vegetables, isn't it? It's a wider concept.
Yes, because it's about how we provide for all our material needs from a working relationship with nature. And so that's the built environment, tools and technology, and all the human organisational things, everything right through to the design of our money systems and our land ownership structures. Absolutely, housing. So the focus on food is so strong because of the recognition that the food supply chain, when we look at from the farm to the disposal of waste, is the biggest component of our environmental impact, and it's our biggest vulnerability. So whatever issue we're looking at, food is actually central to it. So permaculture certainly focuses a lot, but it's not confined to food.
And the whole thing of it, like there's no waste in nature, and so permaculture, there's no waste within that, minimising it.
Yeah, so the principles of permaculture come from the observation of natural systems through the science of ecology, and also what are the proven ways of human survival throughout humanity's long history before the modern world, when we started to do everything in very different ways.
Would you say that we're like artificially sustaining everybody on the planet at the moment?
Oh, well, absolutely. The evidence is cannot be debated that fossil fuels are the underlying reason why we became 7+ billion people. And not just that there's so many of us, but instead of us just tending our gardens or working and living in simple ways, that we've massively expanded our impacts, especially the billion or so middle class people on the planet, through the huge and complex and damaging ways that we live.
Industrial scale, everything.
Yeah.
I'm going to adjust the camera. Right, and David, how can permaculture help with the twin problems really of resource depletion and climate change? Now that the two sort of interlinked in a way, the solutions and for them.
Very much interlinked because...
Well, can you start that by saying resource depletion and climate change are very much interlinked?
Yeah. Resource depletion and climate change are very much interlinked. In a system sense, it's resource depletion is what we put in our mouth, and climate change is what comes out the other end, or it's what we put in our fuel tank versus what comes out the tailpipe. Both are part of a whole system, and you've got to look at the whole system together. So in a broad sense, the high quality energy from fossil fuel and from all of the other resources that we're extracting out of nature, both the are the non-renewable ones like metals, and the renewable ones in theory like forests and soil and nature's biodiversity. The depletion or destruction of those and the pollution in all its different forms, but especially climate change, are fundamentally linked. And the solutions are also linked in that production-consumption cycle of bringing that home to say, well, what is all of this system for? It's basically to support people. And when we analyse it, most of it is really to support not the multiple billions of poor people on the planet, and surprisingly not the 0.01% who might represent the elite, but it's really mostly to support the billion or so middle class people on the planet. And so that population reorganising how they live through simple, local, low energy, renewable ways of living has a huge potential to address both issues. Yeah. Now, permaculture is actually working at both the levels of what can the billion or so middle class people do, and that's how we'd see permaculture somewhere like Australia, but it's also working at that other level of how can basic needs be provided by people working with their own local resources in some of the poorest countries in the world.
And does living a permaculture sort of lifestyle mean going backwards in our technology and modernity, or is it just a re-evaluating of what we consider to be modern?
Permaculture uses the best aspects of modernity, especially design science. To design things is actually not a natural, obvious skill. It's like a literacy that comes with considerable effort and concentration. But like a literacy in words or numeracy, it can be spread by all sorts of different means. And that allows us to adapt to changing conditions. But if we do that down more at the personal level rather than this large scale, then we can more directly address what are real human needs and cut out, if you like, a lot of the unnecessary processes. If you like, it's cutting out a lot of the middlemen. When we grow food in our garden, we disconnect, or the economists use the term disintermediate, all of the supply chains along the way, the transport, all of these other things. And we do more of these things for ourselves. That actually really simplifies things. But for us, it's actually a great deal of complexity, of interest. It's not drudgery. It's actually, we need to be very capable and engaged if we are going to build sustainable houses, if we are going to provide for things in local small-scale ways. But certainly in terms of the big, flashy, super complex technology that can only be done by governments and corporations, the permaculture future will involve much, much less of that. Yeah. And for people emotionally attached to that as being the symbol of our civilization, then yeah, it might be a boring world.
And as I was discussing outside about Ian Lowe was talking about how organic food can feed the world. Can organic food feed the world, and how? Because it requires relocalization and things like that.
Well, there's some substantial problems of going from where we are to sustainable agriculture based on organic principles. And some of that's in what happens on farms, but a lot of it is to do with where food's produced. And essentially we need to get farming land, good quality farming land, back to producing basic staples like grains, non-perishable goods that can be transported reasonably and are not as demanding on the soil. And we need to get the really demanding things like vegetables and fruits produced where they can best be produced in garden agriculture where people live. So that means a lot of the fresh food production needs to move into the city. The areas of land required to do that are actually surprisingly small, because gardening, done well, is actually way more productive than broad-scale farming. It does require a lot of fertility and it does require a lot of water, but those are two things that are commonly available in cities. Often too much surplus stormwater and too concentrated an amount of nutrients, especially of course in human waste. So the recycling of human waste back to land, the replacement of all of the artificial fertilisers which all come from fossil fuel and depleting resources, using the natural available organic fertility where it is generated, which is mostly where people live, is all part of a cycle that can certainly support the world. Some of the other issues are about difficult political ownership, control of land issues. For poor people to be fed, in many countries the debt burden is an artificial construction that requires those countries to export high value crops, prevents that land being used to feed people. So that land is typically growing cotton, so those billion middle class people can throw away their clothes and buy some new ones each year. So of course cotton uses a lot of water, a lot of fertility and very good land. Most of that land should be growing food for people. So that's just one example. Biofuels of course is another one, and then another large one is the growing of crops, of often high quality crops that could be fed to humans being fed to animals, which are then consumed by people who are already eating too much meat. So when we look at all those things together, rather than just saying, oh, could an organic version of industrial agriculture feed the world, then it's quite a different answer. Because maybe it's no to an industrial centralised version of organics. But when we look at all of the related structural things, which are actually inherently part of the lineage of organic agriculture, and certainly a very strong part of permaculture, that we produce more food where people live, that we allocate land to proper priorities, rather than just whoever holds up the most dollars gets whatever they want. Because that world logically ends up with the cars of the billion middle class people outbidding the rest of the population for their food supply, and then turning it into biofuel. So, clearly a global market system is a path to suicide.
What are the problems with biofuel?
The biofuel problem is that the crops that are being grown to produce the sugars or the oils that are the basis of biofuels are all essentially the same crops that are human food crops: corn, soybeans, to a lesser extent ones like palm oil. They're all using land, and sometimes the best land available. they're all using lots of fertiliser and using water. So that's the problem. Of course, when done on a very small scale, on a farm where a farmer is already growing those crops and then keeping some of that so their farm is self-sufficient in fuel, maybe is not a problem. But the idea that everyone is going to drive their cars around based on that is a disaster of ridiculous proportions.
And, because it made me think of something then when we talk about those farms in Africa locked into stuff. Like, one of the problems, what do you think about the free trade agreements, like legally locking us into overconsumption and continual wrecking the planet? It's like we're legally bound to do it. Did you see that as a major stumbling block there?
Well, many of the directions that globalised free trade is going in its last dying stages, because it is in a collapse phase, is of course desperate and ridiculous. So these free trade agreements and that are being negotiated in secret clearly don't increase local food security or reduce environmental impact. They do all the wrong things, but they are so extreme in going the wrong direction may be a cause for people to be very pessimistic. But I also see that these are signs of desperation, because the globalised system of food supply controlled by corporations is running into its own limits, and that's why they are trying all these different mechanisms. But all those mechanisms are doomed to fail, and that we will end up with a relocalised food system in some form or another. It just would be a lot better, a lot more equitable, and look after the environment for future generations if it was sensibly designed and developed rather than just happening out of chaotic need when food supply systems in the supermarket fail.
Yeah, and the resources to deplete that you can't afford to ship food around the place anymore, and you have to relocalise. So that was that bit. So we've done the organic food. Oh, now GMOs. Are GMOs the answer? And if not, what are the big dangers about them? And can you grow GMO organically? Like, do you have to use?
Genetically modified organisms have been proposed as one of the great ways that the food supply system will get out of the limits to growth. That story has been around since the first Great Green Revolution, which was, of course, just about using more fertiliser and more fossil fuels. Genetic engineering has yet to really deliver anything significant after massive investments. So I can remember 20 years ago the claims that by now we would have, not just in the laboratory, but already across the world's grain growing regions, nitrogen fixing wheat. In other words, one of our main staple crops would no longer need nitrogen fertiliser or even rotations with legume crops. It would fix its own nitrogen from the atmosphere. That is nowhere in sight. Most of the achievements of the corporations are really just capturing intellectual property rights, where they can say they own this and therefore they can sell it and claim some benefit for the farmer, like being able to spray herbicides over the crop. So genetic engineering has yet to make any significant major contribution to food security. But it has been part of this greater attempt to control world food supply through the control of seeds and really providing a false expectation So the connection between that and organics is really organics has seen from the first stages of genetic engineering that this was a little bit too much of an abnormal intervention in nature, and therefore it really was against organic principles. So almost everywhere in the world, the view of all organic groups is that these two ideas are incompatible. But the main problem is that none of these things have really delivered anything of substance.
Yeah, we had Jill and Cribb spoke about that. They haven't delivered an ounce of extra food or anything like that.
Yeah.
And aren't they more reliant on fossil fuels and things like that as well? Fertilizers and pesticides that they need? Like in a world that's becoming less depleted in resources, like GMOs
GMOs in general may be selected to try and reduce dependence on fertiliser or other inputs, but mostly it's been the other way. There's been an increase in inputs. The most dramatic, of course, is the Roundup-ready crops, where because of their resistance to the most commonly used herbicide, the herbicides can be sprayed over the crop. Well, that allows and then encourages more use of herbicide.
Yeah.
Well, herbicides are very, very energy expensive to make, basically a product of the fossil fuel world. So in a world of depleting resources, herbicides will get much, much more expensive, apart from all the other issues that are leading to increasing evidence of toxic effects, that now countries are actually banning some of these most commonly used herbicides.
And they're saying a lot of combination of herbicides is one of the things affecting bees.
Yes, the effect on bees is an example of very complex interactions between different chemicals, and the evidence that Roundup, as the glyphosate chemical in Roundup, is associated with a massive increase in kidney failure in Sri Lanka, in El Salvador, Brazil and other countries, has been now shown to be a complex interaction between that and water, very hard mineralised water, and other elements in the soil and the environment that are contaminants from fertilisers. So there's very complex interactions that are actually leading to, quite severe epidemic of kidney failure. Not showing up in rich countries so far because people aren't drinking the hard water, or they're not exposed to the arsenic or cadmium or other things that are producing that in those countries. But it's like most of these things when we intervene in nature, we often don't understand the consequences. So from a permaculture point of view, it's not that we don't intervene, but we intervene at a small scale, and we do things reflecting the principles of nature, and we keep watching and observing, and if we make some really bad mistakes, we're the guinea pigs that suffer the consequences first. So in a more localised world, the consequences are more local. So if you do have severe problems, they're at least localised.
Yeah. Okay, and moving on to more the prognosis sort of side of things now. War. I see war as being, like we discussed outside, being one of the biggest obstacles to real environmental and sort of change and us becoming more ecological as a species. What are your thoughts on this, and how you described how you think eventually as resources deplete, war will be a waste of a country's precious resources ultimately, so it might actually lessen.
Yes, well, the environmental problem, we could say, is a war against nature, which really became most problematic after the development of agriculture in the last 10,000 years. And that has led to the collapse of a whole series of civilizations, of overtaxing the environment, again, essentially It has been a war against nature. So we have to now solve that war against nature because there's so many of us. We've used fossil fuels to make that war of an unimaginable scale, and now they are depleting, so we are losing the war against nature. So we have to come to a peace treaty with nature. At the same time that we need to come to a peace treaty with our other human tribes. And that problem essentially is about the same age. Since the development of agriculture and the development of cities and standing armies, human conflict grew in scale where it became completely dysfunctional. And throughout history, wars have occasionally worked to the benefit of the winning group because they captured more resources than it took to engage in it. But as we move into a world of depleting resources, the effort to capture resources, because that's essentially what war is always about. It's not about ideology or any of those things of good and bad, never has been. That cost of capturing things goes up, and what you get back, even if you win, is very little because of depletion of resources. So eventually the learning for humanity is that as we move into a world of less resources, war actually becomes dysfunctional in that broader sense. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
It doesn't achieve what its real purpose is.
Yeah.
Of course, this is a difficult discussion for people because they often don't acknowledge that war has a real purpose, which is capture of resources.
Yeah.
So if that doesn't work, the groups that attempt it will fail faster. A lot of mess and mayhem happens in the process, but sooner or later, human civilization will realise that war isn't worth it because there's not enough return from even winning.
Yeah.
So I think that's a sort of a positive aspect, but it means we do have to solve that problem because we drive ourselves down even faster by engaging in conflict in the modern scale.
That's a good point. Let me kind of angle a little bit. Yeah, what we talked about outside before about like saving the earth as opposed as over saving ourselves. We discussed that a bit now. Which you think is more important? Why saving ourselves is more important than saving the earth?
Yeah, in my permaculture teaching, I have always said that the planet will look after itself when we step back far enough in the broadest sense. In the same way that the planet looked after itself through the destruction of ice ages and other extinctions, all of the basic functions of the planet continue. So it's possible for there to be mayhem on an enormous scale, and this Earth system that we are part of has still a power far greater than any damage we could do to it. Now, some people might interpret that as an excuse for doing that damage, but what all of traditional cultures teach and what all of science shows is that we damage ourselves first. Now, we have a situation in the modern world where for, again, the billion or so middle class people, until very recently, they have been insulated from the damage that is being done on their behalf. But gradually, and now with greater speed, those consequences are coming back. Now, some of that is direct via climate change impacts. A lot more of it is direct by the impacts of resource depletion leading to contracting economies. And the mechanism by which those economies most dramatically collapse or contract is the financial system, which in a way are just products of human imagination and stuff we just make up. But they are all underpinned by resources. So the consequences for humanity of the way we are living are much more direct and immediate than saying, oh, well, maybe we could do so much damage that we could destroy life on Earth. So there's many time scales and scales of damage between those that could occur. And we need to understand that nature will shrug us off, even if we do cause the extinction of many, many species, which we are already doing. But, you know, in the short timeline that we look at things, people say, oh, well, nature hasn't really hit back at humanity yet. We've got all the signs around us that nature is striking back. And that's going to be more of a problem for us than it is for the planet as a whole. So we need to get very clear about these power relationships. Humanity is unprecedented in its power at the moment compared with what it ever has been, but it's not a match for the planet. So holding that idea that we already are and we could have much greater impact on many of the other life forms, let alone future generations. And at the same time recognise that we're really in the process of shooting ourselves in the foot and at risk of shooting ourselves in the head.
Absolutely. As a collective species. Before I give the last question, should we go a little bit into money? Because the only dude I talked about, like we were talking about outside, and I said how, to me money isn't, you sort of said it's underpinned by resources anyway, that ultimately money is, you can't, you can print money, but you can't print oil and you can't print an apple. And so ultimately the really important thing is energy. To me is energy, really. Whether it's energy from a piece of coal or energy from an apple is the ultimate thing that we all need.
Yep.
Maybe we should go into a bit about that because we don't cover the money system too much. But I didn't want to because I thought money is just a made-up construct. It's not real. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, there's this big dilemma in a way between is it the money or is it the natural resources which are the basis of reality. I've spent most of my life working about how to understand the natural resource base, both the renewable and the non-renewable resources that underpin human existence, and how we reorganise that. Money is just an instrument or a lubricant that we can redesign in whichever way we like. So I've always seen money as of less importance, and that is definitely the case. And, for me, real wealth in a stack of firewood, in a house that heats itself from the sun, living without debt, within one's means, having a larder of preserved food is more important than money in the bank. All of those things are very much part of permaculture. But I think it's also important to understand that the old system that's passing, that's unsustainable, most of its ability to work is designed around these constructs of money. And it's possible that when they fail, all of the machinery that delivers all of the real material things seizes up. That when credit fails, the food is no longer in the supermarket, even though the food is sitting on in some farmer's field. The oil remains somewhere on the other side of the world. So the issue of money is both at one level superficial and at another level very, very immediate. So the world will survive a collapse in monetary systems, but we've never had a world where money has been so much the gateway keeper to everything that people need. It's really, the way we draw it in a diagrammatic sense is to say that the monetary economy was the icing on the cake of the household and community economies that did not involve money. Growing food at home is an example of that. And then all of that was underpinned by the economy of nature, the fact that soil fertility is a naturally renewing thing, that the rivers self-purify, all of the ecosystem services, the economy of nature. Both of those economies, the household and community economies and the economy of nature, have been sucked dry, and all of that activity has gone up into the monetary economy. So monetary economies throughout history just periodically collapse and are restarted, the rules are rewritten, but the underlying economies are still there. That's true today, but those underlying economies are very thin.
The resources is depleted, the money's gone up.
Yeah, and so not only the resources depleted, but the activity is all structurally in the money economy. So it's like people who only live in the monetary economy looking at someone who has a robust household and community economy can't understand how people can afford to live with so little money, that they must be very poor. Well, not necessarily. If you have a robust ways of local exchange, gift, barter, just the normal things that happen in a household where we do things for each other in a family. And so economics, until very recently, was always underpinned by this, very strong base. So in one sense, money is completely superficial and can be redesigned and reset, and we can wipe debt out and start again. And in another sense, we've got ourselves into such a deep hole with it that getting out of that hole is going to be problematic, to say the least.
All right, I'll change the camera angle for the last question. Cool. All right, David, last question. So what's your prognosis for our civilization? Where do you think this is all going to go?
Well, it depends on how long we look into the future. I think we are facing some extremely severe multiple crises between now and the middle of this century, where changes will be experienced by people as confusing and traumatic, and very, very severe scenarios are possible. My future scenarios work maps some of those. They all involve some sort of energy descent where we have less resources, but I think some of the things that could emerge out of those crises are actually a world that's better for people. I don't think we'll get there without pain and suffering, but I think it is possible that in future generations people will be living sustainably, and that they'll experience that as a rich world, and they'll look back on the dysfunctional extreme materialism of this world with amazement that people could live in such hideous conditions and work so hard and be so discontented as exist in the modern world. So I think...
What do you mean hideous conditions, as in people were in great, with all this opulence and plasma televisions and...
Yeah, well, I suppose the extremity of that is the huge increase in wealth for the rising middle class in cities in China like Beijing, but they can't actually walk down the street without feeling their lungs are collapsing. I suppose in countries like Australia, we're very insulated from a lot of those things. But at another level, people are at a state of addiction where they actually experience quite minor stresses as catastrophes. The inability to have a shower, the inability to pick up their regular loaf of bread that they pick up every morning at their particular shop. If that wasn't there for a week, this would be a catastrophe. So we will face those sort of crises. In a larger scale, they're not crises. They're not serious problems, but people will experience them as catastrophes because there is so much fear and dysfunction, so much addiction to unsustainable behaviours. And when the hit is not there, any addict suffers a huge withdrawal. So that withdrawal process will society collectively and individually to some extent might not survive that process in the same way that some drug addicts can go through crises of attempting to get off a drug and not just fail, but it's their life that's at stake. So I see that as quite analogous to a lot of the things, and we can see at the psychosocial level, levels of suicide, for example, are actually not only not reduced by material opulence, they appear to be increased compared with many traditional societies. Lots of other measures, and certainly we might experience this world as beneficial or comfortable, and obviously there is a lot of positive feedback loops that keep people where they are and how they are, but I believe people in the future will look at it shaking their heads with disbelief.
Yeah. I'm just going to add one more thing in. And so, do you think there's any hope for humanity? And if so, what is it that gives you hope?
Well, I think the gift from nature that we've squandered essentially in fossil fuels, to just sort of simplify it, still has allowed some human experimentation to occur that would have not have been possible in traditional low-energy societies constrained around the laws of nature and the limits of place. And I think out of that experiment, most of it will be garbage, which will just end up in the dustbin of history. But some small elements will represent breakthroughs in human evolution that we can carry into a new low-energy, materially simpler world, but with a greater consciousness. I think part of that is an enhanced sense of a global consciousness that has certainly come about and been made possible by the modern world. But it should be possible to maintain that without doing twice yearly flights to the other side of the planet. So the mechanisms by which a global awareness have come about aren't necessarily essential to maintain that substantial example of something beneficial that has come from the experiment of industrial modernity. So I think there's great hope in when we take those learnings through into a simpler, relocalised world, that we may be able to do some things that traditional peoples were never able to do. And there's many other examples of that. At the simplest material level, we could say, no, this is not going back to the Stone Age. Imagine skilled tradespeople reworking stainless steel to make fine tools that no traditional society before would have ever been able to do. So even if most of what we value ends up destroyed, the stainless steel will still be there for future generations to fabricate, and they will be enormously grateful of that enduring resource, because without that industrial world, we would have never got that as one example of an amazing and enduring material.
Because I guess ultimately, we are a part of nature, aren't we? And this is the way we evolved.
Yeah, so the wealth from fossil fuel allowed us to experiment. And it's not uncommon in nature when a species gets a huge surplus of energy that most of what happens is dysfunctional. Most ends up as overgrowth and collapse, but somewhere through that process, little pathways of evolutionary advances occur. And so I see lots of possibilities. And permaculture is really about, in a lot of ways, harnessing those for that future.
And just one extra thing, do you think like a new world indigenous culture is going to evolve from this sort of unsustainable modernity, that this global consciousness that you're talking about, that we need to recognise that we're all indigenous to the earth? And as we've talked about in United Natures, the Aborigines can't go back because that's all been bastardised, yet our way has no enduring future. So I really believe that a new global consciousness and indigenousness will form. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I think that comes about from two aspects. One is the return and connection to place that doesn't depend on abstract understandings of being part of being indigenous to the earth. It's actually being directly embedded in a working relationship with nature, which is local. So that re-emergence of indigeneity will recreate eventually, if you like, local languages, local culture, even again tribes. But those will all be hybrids with enormous hybrid vigour from this past mixing. And the hope I mentioned is that we can avoid the downsides of that by maintaining the global understanding that we are all part of the one system. And we've been trying to get those messages for a long time through spiritual traditions that go back 2,000 years that started to say, all people are people. We are all part of this world together. But that is quite a foreign concept to our primitive mind. And the modern world has just given us a really big blast of making it clear that we are all in this together. So when we become relocalised, there's a greater chance that we can actually get that critical message. So indigeneity will be at two levels: indigenous to the planet and indigenous to place.
Excellent. That's it, David. Thank you so much. Got plenty to use there.